animation is mostly something taken for granted. Not that many people really think to see how much work has to go into animation as a whole, and the struggle that 2D, 3D, stop motion, and game animators have to go through and often ends up going underappreciated. The majority of people never care to see the determination and effort that has to go into these processes, and that these processes can take hours and hours just to make what can very much be 40 seconds of animation. And there is proof of this lack of understanding for the peril that animators go through with simply how many people on YouTube and such just say to an animator, just add more frames now, not knowing how much pain that doubling the FPS ends up causing. And I'm sure you've seen people animate in softwares before, the main examples being Blender, 3ds Max, Source Filmmaker, and obviously Disney has their own program that they use to make their films, but this can be a hard process for game animators specifically. And you think with those previously mentioned softwares, you can just record an animation as if you were making a film, just copy and paste into a character model in the game, and just pray that it'll work. Well, yes and no. Yes, it's as simple as make animation, create game model, place into game, but there's multiple other nuances to this process than would be animating a 3D film for animation in games. And thus I, a person with no experience in animating other than using SFM for a day, will take your time to explain why animation in games is a different and more difficult process than animating a film, and I will also talk about why animation in games is an amazing concept that pleases me to no end. Until it does. Alright, before the video really starts, I'm just going to say two things. First of all, these videos recorded at different parts of the day, so basically one time I'll be recording at like 11 PM, so I'll be a bit more groggy, and other times I'll be recording at like 3 PM, which means I'm actually a bit more excited and able to speak clearly. So yeah, there's that. And also, look at this funny GIF I found. It'll be in the corner of the screen, so if there's any sections that you don't like, you could just look at it to distract yourself, and once I start finally talking about something that's actually interesting and bearable for me to say, you can start watching the video again, so basically remove any downtime. Now, speaking of films, I believe this is a good place to start off to get an understanding of 3D and potentially the 2D animation as a whole. We'll be talking mostly about 3D animation since it's more closely related to game animation, or at least the type of game animation I'm worried about. 3D films started with Toy Story in 1995 as the first successful film to be rendered in only 3D, leading to other movies like Chicken Little, Up, Cars 2, Shrek, Lorax, WALL-E, Space Chimps 1 and 2, Lego The Adventures of Captain Clutch Powers, Monsters vs. Aliens, Igor, Robots, and Hoodwink. Yes, those last ones I listed from Lorax onwards were from my childhood. This could also be applied to claymation stop-motion films, main examples being Nightmare Before Christmas, and although a TV show not a film, Trapdoor is also another big example. Another case is live-action films like Rise of the Guardians, which add CGI to their films. Yes, I also listed Rise of the Guardians because of childhood reasons. Shut up. Now, nearly all of these films listed fall within the many laws of animation. Although meant for 2D animation, multiple of the 12 rules of animation are still followed within 3D animation. The main ones being squash and stretch, anticipation, staging, slow in slow out, arcs, secondary action, exaggeration, solid drawing, well, technically it applies to 3D, and appeal. And thus, with these previously mentioned laws of animation, 3D movie animators can use these principles in a way that helps them produce film scenes in an effective, believable, and impressive way. However, games on the other hand lose multiple qualities of life that would help them use these laws of animations to make their works impressive, and it's all simply down to the camera. For film animations, the animators are usually in control of the camera, and even if they couldn't choose where it could be because this director is stubborn, they still know how to tailor the character's motions in a way that works best from that angle. They already know what makes a character's performance work, and they can decide whether they want to go all out in making a character do the most crazy and intelligent or awesome the actions that they can possibly do. Meanwhile, game animators do not get this luxury. And I do know that I'm talking about animation that's in-game, since a cutscene is basically just a short film in terms of game design. And that is unless your game is literally just a big cutscene. But for the gameplay side of things, this is where some major inconveniences start appearing for game animators. Since once again, the main issue of animation in games is the camera, since the camera is usually in control of the player and not the animator. So this forces animators to take time into ensuring that an animation looks clear and good enough to look at from most angles. This can make certain animations look bland when compared to the animation design shown in cutscenes, or even bland when compared to movies. This whole forcing the animation to be clear from all angles thing is indeed obsolete when you do factor in that some games do have their camera locked. Punch-Out!, literally any fighting game you can think of, FIFA, most shoot-em-ups, 2D side-scrollers and platformers and Metrovanias, Desert Bus, and a whole host of other games will have their cameras locked at a certain point, and only very rarely will you have a new angle when playing normally. So this will allow the animators to go all out on ensuring that their animation looks best on those angles, because they do know that it won't change almost throughout the entire game. So the camera can be in control or out of control of the animator, so the animator needs to work around that. Is that all, I hear you ask? No. Sure, you may have animations that look good from the camera angle shown in game, whether it's because the camera is locked or if it isn't locked and they just worked around it, but now you need those animations to connect to one another. What I mean by that is you want the animations to blend to one after the other seamlessly as opposed to going from pose to pose. No, not that one. No one must be playing GTA and every single input you do snaps the character from standing still to violently sprinting at full speed with no warning simply because the programmers didn't program the animations to blend properly. This forces animators to make animations blend seamlessly together. You want their hands from going from swaying side to side to clearly grabbing something from their pocket whenever you grab an item, while the animators are going to have to go through the pain and coding of programming all that together. You need to program these animations to work together or else you're going to have a janky mess on your hands. And this programming issue applies to not just animations working together, but also making these animations play in general. And that could be an issue since you can almost never detect a glitch in an animation until you have to physically boot up the game prototype and force that animation to play with multiple different conditions going on just to see if it's working as intended. As opposed to filmmaking, where if a problem occurs, they can immediately detect it and fix it once it shows its head. This can be an absolute pain when you give a character multiple different moves and attacks, meaning that you have to test what could be over 100 different animations with each other alongside multiple circumstances just to see if one of them doesn't work correctly when faced with a very specific situation. Like, for example, what happens if you jump directly after doing this one? What if you do a long attack, swap weapons midway through, and get hit into your damaged animations whilst doing that attack? Maybe that could break the animation. There is another issue that game animators face when animating, is that the budget of the games aren't mostly focused on the animation team. Instead, it will be split between writers, programmers, sound designers, music producers, beta testers, modelers, Jerry, concept artists, the animation team, and other companies if they get help from said companies. This doesn't mean that the quality of the animations won't be completely gimped, but it's because of this, the cutscenes in some of the games and the animations in said games won't be as high quality as before. However, there is some exceptions. Like for example, the cutscenes in Sonic Unleashed are absolutely incredible for what is literally 15 years ago. I know the main focus of this section wasn't about cutscenes and instead about in-game animation, but this one's way too impressive to pass up, and it's the only opportunity I get to talk about how stupidly insane Sonic Unleashed's cutscenes are. And remember, the budget of the game isn't focused on the animation team alone. Oh, now remember when I listed a bunch of laws of animation? Well, this plays well into this next part. Sure, animators can make movements look impressive, but now they need to do it in a way that keeps in mind with the player, because the player wants to enjoy playing the game. And so certain aspects of the animation might be sacrificed in order to make the animation feel responsive. Normally, when you input an action, you want it to happen as fast as possible, meaning things like the second law of animation, anticipation, needs to be sacrificed. Now, what is anticipation? Anticipation is the tell of an action. So in other words, if a character is going to pull something from their pocket, they'll curve their arm high before digging into their pocket for a second or two before grabbing what they were looking for. Anticipation can be used for realism, so if a character is going to punch something, they'll have to animate that wind-up for said punch. However, this causes an issue for games, since everything will feel sluggish if the character will take a second or two to realistically pull back their sword to charge up a swing midway through a battle. And so animators will have to remove the anticipation windup for these attacks or reduce how much time they would realistically take. However, this can be quite flexible and altered for balance. And so normally what happens is weaker attacks will come out faster, meanwhile stronger attacks will come out slower with larger anticipation windows, which means you'll have to commit to these moves much harder, causing a higher likelihood to be punished and hit out of these moves. Take Real Impact from the Devil May Cry series, a good example of long anticipation time to hit an enemy with a devastating move. Dante curls up into a fighting stance, sets a cheesy line, winds up his right arm for an uppercut, and when he hits, a satisfying explosion of damage occurs. However, if you're careless, you could just have the enemy move out of the way of the attack, or even worse, let them get a big hit of their own. However, as opposed to the Cerberus from the same game, which has a very fast attack at the cost of low damage, which means that the whole balance of low damage quick speed versus slow speed high damage is built into the balance of multiple games, and DMC is just a good example of it. With the only case of high damage attacks being fast if they have no range, or a lot of what's known as ending lag. Ending lag is the time it takes for the animation to finish after it's performed, so you're locked into the animation for long enough to be punished if you miss. However, characters who do have anticipation windows is your enemies. Enemies need anticipation timings to make fighting them fair and fun, especially when paired with a sound cue. Take these demons from DMC 3 that I like to call Monkey Men. You'll see why. They leap backwards, let out a loud cry, and then charge forward with a side slash. Just from hearing the sound alone, you can understand why I call them monkeys. Or take this one, which kneels violently, curls up, before teleporting towards you with a slash. An example of good anticipation timings with bosses and enemies is timings that are so fast that they feel like they were instant, but were slow enough to make you realize it was your fault that you got hit by it. Most of the time. And normally the balance for these games is that the further you go, the shorter and shorter these anticipation windups are going to be for the later game bosses and enemies. Take Punch-Out as a big example. The first few boxers only clear showcases that go into attack. Take Von Kaiser's head ticks for example. Or hell, in some cases like Disco Kid, he even tells you, "Here it comes!" But take the late game opponents like Bold Bull, who have attacks that are only 22 frames long, which is 0.37 seconds by the way, and they hit hard. Some games will even add little flashes to signify if an attack will be coming or not, and will even give different colors to indicate what type of attack is going on, like Metal Gear Rising, which will add a red flash on parryable attacks and yellow on unparryables, or Ultra Kill that places yellow for parryable attacks and blue for unparryables, until it lets you parry them. Another point is the machine-like precision of these characters, and how well they can recreate the same action they've done over and over again. This comes down to making animations fast and put less stress on the animators. If the animators did have to make multiple sets of animations for reloads just to simulate real human error and variety, it would be taxing and painful to them. And speaking of human error, although animating the characters fumbling around with the magazine just to get into the gun would be realistic to the lesser experienced shooter, it would be annoying just to have a reload last for longer just because the person you were playing just goofed up out of nowhere. And so, animators avoid this issue by making one reload and making it perfect with no mistakes out of the character. And although I will not go into the art of satisfying reloads in this, do know that this does give animators breathing room to make reloads as fancy as possible, since they don't have to worry about making the character mess up within the animation unless specifically told to. The only other case where I can find animations being different for same gun is the sleight of hand perk from the modern Modern Warfare games. This doesn't just apply to guns and reloads, but to sword animations and overall just the whole consensus of actions that characters can do in the first place. The only game I can think of that does this alternate animation thing is DMC2. I'm going to say nothing positive about DMC2 by the way. And in DMC2, the start of the sword combo has two different startup swings, but that's the game picking one of two animations from RNG alone, and there's no real coding in the animation to have the angle of their arm change or something along those lines. It's merely just a 50-50 coin toss. Another middle finger animators have to make towards realism is animating characters that move at crazy high speeds. This is normally done in two ways, after images and adding more slashes than what's actually going on. And they will even sometimes make the character disappear for this effect to be more impactful. It is mostly anime games that do this, since anime is more prone to doing crazy stuff, but other medias will also use their effect in their games, or even some movies will even use this process as well. This process of making animations like this, if the character is moving so fast, is usually done because the lore will be stating that they're moving, I don't know, like 10% of the speed of light, which means if the animators did somehow animate all those individual slashes at the exact speed stated in the lore, there will only be so many frames to process that. You would need a frame rate well into the 10,000s to process that, and that might not even be enough. Furthermore, they would just be frantically flailing around like a maniac if they realistically animated it, and you wouldn't be able to tell what the hell is even going on. Decent examples of animating characters moving at high speeds, with main examples coming from the Devil May Cry series again, with the move Melee and Stab. This move pretty much exists in all of the games, except DMC2, and is a good example of how the game's animation improved over time, which I'll go into more detail on later. DMC1 doesn't really add any special effects, simply because it's both old and probably doesn't care. DMC3 is where more fancy stuff really happens, with the comic book style of animating the attack, with multiple after images of the tip of the blade appearing in random directions in a cone around where Dante is stabbing, with a violent tornado going around the base of the sword. In DMC4, it goes for more like an anime feel, with animating what feels like it was literally a million stabs, with once again a bunch of after images of the sword's tips, but they're all red hot to make it look cooler. And DMC5 goes for more of a mixture of DMC3s and 4s, with going what looks to be more heavier stabs as compared to DMC4's weaker rapid stabs. In fact, Virgil from DMC5 has his own version of Million Stab, and it looks closer to DMC4's version, simply because Virgil is Dante's opposite and is more focused on speed and hastiness as opposed to Dante's high strength. Okay, maybe DMC2 has one, but it's similar to DMC3 but nowhere near as impactful, and I refuse to give this game any more credit simply for how awful it is. Basically, the reason why DMC2's Million Stab sucks is because it has the after images, much like DMC3, but the sword itself actually just disappears, which kind of sucks, so it just looks weird, as it's just, where the hell is he spawning all these swords from? Like, the only thing I might give DMC2 credit for is Majin Devil Trigger, which is actually quite badass, but it doesn't return anywhere else in the rest of the series. Closest thing you're going to get to Majin Devil Trigger is Sin Devil Trigger in DMC5, which I don't even think they were even based off of each other. But enough about realism. Most animations today is good enough to look lifelike, and is pretty well organized to handle any issues to do with light speed character movements, like this. How about we talk about animation from years ago, leading up to today, how animation has improved, and how it pays homage to other older animations of the 90s and early 2000s, and how can you take a 2D sprite and recreate its movements in 3D. Let's start with 2D game animation. Pixel art goes well back to the first, in quotation marks, video game made on transistors in 1958. It mostly took the role of a simple tennis game and is nowhere near impressive by today's standards, other than the fact that it's the first video game. This leads up into the 70s, where arcade games like Pong were blowing up. And then, in the early 80s, this led to Donkey Kong, Gauntlet, Polybius, Galaga, and the game Market Crash. Then, in the late 80s, this gave way to the home consoles like the NES. Before the early 90s, actually no, if I went into the whole list of games progressionally up to date, we'd be here forever. Let's just get a general sense of where quality was being updated for the years beyond the Bit Wars, and then talk about the highlights of animation progression in these advancements. At this point in game creation, every kilobyte's worth of data was worth saving, which means recycling assets and losing out on some aspects was common. Not so much on arcades, since due to their larger size compared to home consoles, and especially the game cartridges that were put into these home consoles, a lot more data could be stored on them, but they still had to save as much data as they could. This whole concept of arcades being better than home consoles remained the same until the early 90s with the introduction of the Sega Genesis and overall the age of the 16-bit era for home consoles. And thus the Bit Wars spawned, and although I won't be talking about it all too much in terms of the whole side of the companies Nintendo and Sega fighting together, and Atari, they were there as well. But overall, the most I'm going to talk about with the Bit Wars is the whole fact that the more bits the better. 32 bits being a blessing and starting the overall concept of 3D as a whole, and 64 bits being a god number. I'm sure you get the point, more bits the better. But everything changed when 64 bits was rightfully achieved by Nintendo.
I know Jaguar did it first, but it doesn't count.
And thus the first successful 3D console was made, the N64. Although attempts at 3D was done beforehand on other consoles, and I will talk about them in this next section, the N64 is generally the first successful one.
Hey, this definitely isn't me saying this afterwards, but me saying that the N64 was the first successful 3D console is kinda null and void because as I was writing this script I forgot the fact that PlayStation 1 was a thing, so gabagool.
Going back to how I stated that I would be talking about previous attempts at 3D, let's take Star Fox on SNES for an example. For what was a 16-bit console with weaker processing power, the SNES performs well under the face of 3D, and it was even capable of playing Wolfenstein and Doom. Barely, but it could play them. Hell, they even got rid of Hitler's mustache in Wolfenstein. Sega attempted their own take on the 3D concept with their 32X add-on for the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive, depending on where you live, and they were somehow worse than the SNES in terms of performance, even though the SNES was half the power of the 32X, but the 3D was there in those attempts. But enough getting sidetracked, we need to get on to what matters, and that is the N64's take on animation. And this poses a new issue for Nintendo and Rare in terms of how they would animate their characters. The 2D sprites of the arcade, NES, and SNES were easy since they were just pre-drawn sprites. Without the inclusion of the Z-axis and 3D models, hand-making pre-scripted animations where rigged 3D models came with its own drawbacks, and all came to moving around the joints like the elbows and knees. If you take a look at the Mario models over the years, and generally look at 3D models in general, you'll see that there's a high amount of polycounts around the joints. Or in the case of Mario on the N64, he was just segmented into pieces and doesn't even have any elbows or knees. Now why is this? Well, it's because bending these joints with low polycounts around these areas can cause some very cursed looking texture warping and some very sharp bends, and so they need a higher polycount around these joints to make movements look realistic and non-mutilating. And because they needed to save resources and data back in the N64 days, they had to give up on the elbows and knees for now and make N64 Marios segmented. This is the start of 3D animation in games, and it only got better as time passed. The main thing encountered early into the transition from 2D into 3D was how animators are going to recreate classic animations and make them better suited for 3D. Although some may not be one-to-one recreations of the old sprite work, they either come close to the original or even improve on it in their quest of modernization. A great example is from Punch-Out for the Wii.
Yes, I mentioned it 3 times now.
It takes the animations from the old NES games and SNES games and suing them for 3D space in an effective and yet believable way. While it still retains the charm of the original, it's done in such a way that it just makes it feel amazing. And you feel like these are real characters that you could talk to in real life. And I'm gonna keep it short for the sake of simplicity, but Punch-Out for the Wii has so much character and strange nuances that just makes it such an amazing game, and I'm still finding out things about it today. If I were to talk about every single weird nuance that this game has, it would just increase the length of the video by a while. If I talk about dumb mechanics like how Lil Mac's eyes follow the opponent despite the fact you never get to see him in the middle of a match because you never get to see his face, it's just things like that just impresses me about this game. An upgrade from 2D to 3D can be a drastic one, but it can lead to an improved series, or bad improvement in some cases. But what about games that were 3D at first, and had sequels that improve on already existing 3D animation? This is a commonplace in some games where they'll improve on the old animation seen in previous installments, and there's no better example than, you guessed it, the DMC series. Just bear with me here. Yes, I love this game series, but that's not why I'm milking it so much, it's just that incredible. In DMC, there's many returning moves and attacks from previous games. I already covered how Million Staff has improved over the series, but that's nowhere near the only returning attack from the series. This game is just jam-packed with returning abilities, some directly and some not so much. There is so much in this game that returns from previous titles, and they may even have a sense of humor about it. Take Kick 13 from the first game. It comes back in the 4th and then the 5th, although it doesn't return in 2 and 3. It does make its return in the 4th game, and it even appears twice, and technically 3 times. Round Trip is in all of the games except the second one. Okay, maybe the second one. Stinger, a move where he lunges forward with a heavy stab. It's in all the games, even DMC 2, but it's kind of pathetic there. and the aforementioned real impact. Have a guess what game doesn't have it? Team C1. As they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. A lot of games will contain these references to previous moves or just bring them back but better, with Guilty Gear being a main example of taking old and making new. Ever since the series has been going since 1988, they have been trying their best to make every single attack feel amazing to use and also bring back old ones for nostalgia purposes or just because they were just so amazing that they couldn't leave it back into the coffins of the old games. But let's go to homages and other references. In these games, they can range from movie references, which are still common, but we want to look at games making references to other games that came before it. Some games can be nothing but references, some may have heavy lore implications, and some can be hard to find, like some Battlefield secret reloads, and other games references are just absolutely cursed.
Well, this one could be considered more of a fourth wall break than anything.
Yeah, it's a fourth wall break. And finally, an issue that although can be linked to movies, but is quite commonly found within games as well, and that's the issue of hand animation versus motion capture. If you don't know what I'm talking about, hand animation relates to someone using an animation within a software, and motion capture relates to someone using a special suit that records their exact movements and makes the animation as lifelike as possible, since that animation is coming from real life. And the issue this brings is when the motion capture is used quite freely, and this can lead to some major issues unless the person in the suit is really amazing at what he's doing. However, if the person being motion captured isn't that good at his job, then it'll be gratuitously overacted or way too lifeless, and you'll just generally be sitting there wondering, what the hell is that man doing? Motion capture's main issue is when you're dealing with cartoonish characters that are normally more bouncy and expressive, and by making them grounded to reality by giving a sense of weight that is human-like for what may not be a human-looking thing can cause issues in terms of how you perceive it and can break your immersion. Hand animation, on the other hand,
Get it?
suffers from being uncanny. You can clearly see what they're doing, but there's still something wrong about it and does not feel true to life nor does it feel that human. Or in the case of older games, the animation could just look flat out robotic. So when should you use hand animation and when should you use motion capture? If the art style is cartoonish, then realism is not what you should be going for, and thus hand animation is a better option. But you may be able to get away with motion capture if, once again, the person in the suit is really good at his job. If you're creating animations for non-human characters or creatures, then it may not be the same dimensions as a human, and then hand animation has to be the best whole, as you can't really recreate the animation of, I don't know, a goat using a person to motion capture it. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. What I'm basically trying to say is, use motion capture sparingly. It can be an amazing tool and quite fluid when compared to hand animation, but when it's done wrong, it could be very wrong, and it could be horribly overacted and painful to watch if done horribly. As an animator called Noodle described, motion capture is a tool, and you gotta be using the right tool for the right job. A hammer is a good way for driving in nails and pulling them out, but you don't want to use it to wash your car, and that's why you have a pressure washer. But you don't use a pressure washer to cut wood, so that's why you have a saw for it. So what I'm trying to say is, don't use motion capture freely. However, going back to the dated hand animations of the old 2000s, there's a certain charm to these old animations that you can very clearly tell are off by a large margin, but you like the fact that they feel weird and uncanny. Weird actions like this that are realistic but also not really at the same time feel right in place at the time these games are being made. Bonus points if that old game is so old that it actually has a launcher. Not you, Dark Tide. You're from 2022. So, what is there to learn from all this? Well, if the intro is anything to go by, you might just take my comment of me not having any animation experience in any way, shape, or form, and just take all my points as being null and void. But in all seriousness, I really wanted to make this because the animation in games is something I love. And animations in the game is the key thing to make you feel amazing whilst playing. And after watching a video from New Game Plus, someone who knows how to animate, where he talks about Punch-Out for the Wii and its animation, the whole process that goes into animations in games that he briefly covered in the intro really hit me, and I just really wanted to learn more. And yes, you can hark on me from taking some of his examples and points, And overall, this video just took me a while to make. In the 12-week period of time I had to make this, 50% of it was just blown on the script of this video. Why? Because I suck at writing. Also, I get distracted easily. And I suck at managing my time. And I just go off to play games, like Darktide, which I burned 62 hours into in these 2 weeks. 2 weeks and I burnt 62 hours into what could be placed into, you know, making this goddamn college project. Seriously, this script took so long. I found a new favorite game, Guilty Gear. You notice how I brought up DMC a lot, because at the time of writing I loved DMC, but this script took so long I found a new game to sink my teeth into, and now I don't care for DMC anymore, I just want to talk about Guilty Gear now. I need to get my act together, man. Oh my god.